Let's get started. Story number 1.
The rain had been pouring down relentlessly for hours, the sound of it tapping against the windows more like a constant drumming than a gentle rainfall. The wind howled through the trees outside, bending the branches, shaking the house on its foundation. I had always loved storms. There was something about the way they made the world feel more alive, more connected to something ancient. But tonight was different. There was an undercurrent to the storm, something unsettling in the air that made my skin crawl. It was a Friday night, and I had the house to myself. My roommates had gone out for the weekend, leaving me alone in our small but cozy townhouse on the outskirts of town. Normally, I enjoyed the solitude. I could do what I wanted, watch movies in my pajamas, read without interruption. But tonight, as the storm intensified, I found myself more on edge than usual. The house, creaky and old as it was, had always felt safe. But tonight the walls seemed to press in on me. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and settled onto the couch with a cup of tea. The soft hum of the television was the only sound other than the storm. As I sipped my tea, I tried to focus on the movie I had picked out, but my eyes kept wandering to the shadows in the corners of the room. The rain pounded against the windows, and I could hear the occasional clap of thunder, but everything felt muffled, distant. I told myself it was nothing. The house was old, the wind was howling, and the darkness was just that. The darkness. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air in the room seemed thicker, colder somehow. I could feel the temperature drop, the warmth from my tea doing little to counter the chill that had settled in my bones. I glanced toward the hallway. The light from the living room barely illuminated the narrow passageway, but something about it caught my attention. The front door, which I was sure I had locked earlier, was slightly ajar. Just a crack, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I stood up, my legs unsteady as I moved toward the door, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew something was off. I had locked the door before sitting down on the couch, hadn't I? I reached the door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open the rest of the way. The hinges groaned in protest, and I stepped into the hallway. The door was open now, the wind howling through the crack, making the house feel colder still. But there was something else now. A sound. A soft, scratching noise coming from somewhere deeper in the house, from upstairs. I froze, listening intently. It was almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder the longer I stood there. It was like something, or someone, was dragging its feet across the wooden floors above me. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be the wind. The sound was deliberate, slow, like something was moving with purpose. I hesitated for a moment, then moved toward the stairs. Each step I took seemed louder than the last, the old wood creaking beneath my feet, as though the house itself was alive and listening. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood there, straining to hear. The scratching noise had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. My heart hammered in my chest. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. Something was drawing me upward. Something was waiting. I took the first step up, then the second. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, and I winced with each step, fearing that the sound would give away my position. The house was so quiet now, the only noise the soft patter of rain against the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder outside. When I reached the top of the stairs, the scratching sound began again, this time louder, closer. I followed the noise, my feet moving on their own, until I reached the door to the spare bedroom. It was the last room at the end of the hall, the door closed. But now I noticed something strange. The door was ajar, just slightly, enough to see a sliver of darkness on the other side. I reached for the door handle and paused. My hand hovered above it for a long moment, my breath shallow. There was something wrong here, something that didn't belong. The scratching noise grew louder. I couldn't stop myself any longer. I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim hallway behind me. The air inside was cold, freezing even, as if the room itself had been emptied of warmth. The first thing I noticed was the bed. It was unmade, the sheets tangled in a mess that hadn't been there earlier. The bed was old, the wooden frame worn from years of use, but it wasn't the bed that caught my attention. It was the mirror on the far wall. The glass was cracked, the surface darkened with age and neglect. but it was the reflection that made my blood run cold. For a brief moment, I saw it, something standing behind me, just out of view. A dark figure, a shadow that seemed to sway with the flickering of the light. I spun around, but the room was empty. Nothing was there. I was breathing heavily now, my heart racing. I turned back to the mirror. The shadow was gone, but something felt off. The reflection in the mirror wasn't quite right. It was as though the room behind me was distorted, the angles wrong, the shadows deeper. I took a step back, my feet slipping slightly on the wooden floor. The cold air seemed to press in around me, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Get out." I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. "Get out." I turned and fled from the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran down the stairs, almost tripping over the last step, and dashed for the front door. I didn't care that the storm was still raging outside. I just needed to leave. I needed to get away. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking as I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I yanked at the door, but it remained stuck. The house felt alive, the walls closing in around me. The wind howled louder, the rain crashing against the windows like 1,000 hands banging on the glass. "Get out!" The voice was louder now, the words almost a scream. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, the pressure building as though the house itself were trying to push me out. I pulled harder at the door, my fingers numb with fear. Then, with one final desperate tug, the door gave way. I stumbled outside, gasping for air, the rain soaking through my clothes in an instant. I didn't care. I just ran, not stopping, not looking back until I was several blocks away, standing in the middle of the street, my heart still pounding in my chest. I never went back to that house. The next day, I contacted my roommates, telling them about what had happened. They insisted it was just my imagination, that it was probably the storm messing with my head. But I knew what I had felt, what I had seen. I could still hear the whisper in my ears, feel the cold air pressing in on me. The house was abandoned a week later, the landlord citing structural issues as the reason for the sudden evacuation. No one ever mentioned the strange noises, the cold rooms, or the whispers that had haunted it, but I knew, and I never forgot. Even now, when it rains, when the wind howls and the night feels too long, I hear it, soft, faint, but unmistakable. Get out. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The rain had already started by the time Erin turned onto the narrow, winding road leading to her family's old lake house. It wasn't a heavy downpour yet, but the wind had picked up, sending sheets of water across the windshield, making it harder to see through the mist rolling off the lake. She cursed under her breath, gripping the wheel tighter. It had been years since she last visited, and she'd forgotten just how isolated the place really was. The lake house had belonged to her grandparents before they passed. After that, no one in the family had really used it, except for the occasional summer weekend, and even those became rare. When her mother suggested Erin go up there for a few days to escape the stress of work, she had hesitated. It wasn't that she was afraid of the place, she had good memories there, but something about going alone didn't sit right with her. Still, she had reluctantly agreed, convincing herself it would be peaceful. Now, with the storm rolling in and the sky darkening, she wasn't so sure. She pulled into the gravel driveway, her headlights sweeping across the overgrown yard. The house sat at the edge of the lake, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. The windows were dark, lifeless. The porch, once welcoming, looked worn, the wooden boards swollen from years of exposure. She sighed, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was deafening, except for the rhythmic tapping of rain against the roof. Grabbing her bag, she made a dash for the front door, fumbling with the keys before finally pushing it open. The smell of dust and aged wood hit her immediately. The air was thick, unmoving, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. She flicked on the lights, and a dim glow spread across the living room. Everything was exactly as she remembered. The old floral couch, the brick fireplace, the faded paintings of the lake hanging on the walls. Setting her bags down, she moved to the windows and peered outside. The lake was barely visible through the mist, its surface still and black. She used to love swimming here as a kid, but right now it looked like something out of a horror movie. She shuddered and drew the curtains closed. The rain picked up. It started as a steady patter, but quickly turned into a torrential downpour. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Erin took a deep breath. It was just a storm. Nothing to be nervous about. She spent the next hour unpacking and settling in. The kitchen still had old canned goods in the cupboards, and the fridge hummed faintly, surprisingly still functional. She made herself a cup of tea and curled up on the couch, flipping through an old book she had found on the shelf. That's when she heard it, a soft creak. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, old wood shifting with the wind. But then it came again, a distinct, deliberate sound, footsteps. They were faint, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakable, slow, cautious, coming from upstairs. Erin froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hadn't gone upstairs yet. No one had. The house had been locked when she arrived. She held her breath, listening. Silence. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was just on edge because of the storm. She shook her head, forcing a nervous laugh. "Get a grip, Erin," she muttered to herself. Then something thumped. Not loud, but heavy, like something had fallen or been dropped. Her stomach clenched. She grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it tightly in her hands. If someone was up there, she wasn't going to sit around and wait for them to come down. Slowly, she moved toward the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. The upstairs hallway stretched out in front of her, lined with closed doors. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. She reached the first door, the master bedroom. She hesitated, then pushed it open. Empty. The bed was still made, the furniture untouched, nothing out of place. She checked the other rooms, the bathroom, empty. The guest room, empty. Then, the last door at the end of the hall, the storage room. The one she had always been afraid of as a child. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the doorknob. The moment she touched it, a sudden gust of wind rattled the entire house, making the walls groan. She pushed the door open. The room was small, filled with old furniture covered in sheets. A few cardboard boxes stacked in the corner. A single window, its curtains drawn, nothing seemed out of place. But then she noticed something. One of the sheets had been pulled back. The chair beneath it was exposed, and there was something on it. A wet footprint, small, like that of a child. Her breath caught in her throat. That was impossible. She had been alone since she arrived. The doors had been locked. A chill ran down her spine. She backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her. As soon as she did, she heard something. A soft giggle, faint, coming from the hallway. She spun around, but there was nothing but empty air. Her hands shook as she gripped the poker tighter. Her mind screamed at her to run, to leave the house and never look back. But her legs felt rooted to the floor. Then the whisper came, right behind her ear. "You're not supposed to be here," Erin screamed. She bolted down the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She grabbed her keys from the counter and yanked the front door open, stepping into the freezing rain. She didn't care about her bags, didn't care about locking up. She just needed to get out. She jumped into her car, slamming the door shut. Her fingers fumbled with the keys, struggling to start the engine. Then, in the rearview mirror, she saw it, a figure, standing in the upstairs window, watching her. The engine roared to life, and she tore down the driveway, gravel spraying beneath the tires. She didn't stop, didn't slow down until she was miles away, the lake house nothing but a distant memory in her rearview mirror. She never went back. Months later, when she told her mother what had happened, her mother grew pale. "I never wanted to tell you," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But when I was a child, I used to hear things there too. Footsteps, whispering. I always thought it was my imagination." Erin felt her blood run cold. "Then, one night," her mother continued, "I saw him, the little boy, standing in the hallway, that he was soaking wet, and when I asked him who he was, he just smiled and said..." She hesitated. Erin swallowed hard. "What did he say?" Her mother looked away. "He said, 'You're not supposed to be here.'" Story the end.
Story number 3.
The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the roof and windows like ghostly fingers tapping from the other side. The wind howled through the trees, shaking their skeletal branches against the house. Every so often, thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, ominous growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Ethan sat alone in the dimly lit living room, staring at the flickering glow of the television. The movie he had been watching played on, but he wasn't paying attention anymore. He was too distracted by the unsettling feeling that had settled over the house. It was just the storm, he told himself, just the way the wind moaned through the old wooden beams, the way shadows stretched and twisted in the erratic flashes of lightning. But deep down, he knew better. He had felt it all night. Something was off. The air felt heavier, colder than it should have. He could almost swear that he wasn't alone, though he knew he had locked every door, checked every window before settling in. His grandmother's house had always been eerie, even when she was alive. A large, creaking Victorian home at the edge of the woods, it had been in the family for over 100 years. He had spent countless summers there as a child, always uneasy, always avoiding the shadowed corners and the upstairs hallway where the floorboards groaned even when no one was walking. Now, it was his. After she passed, he had inherited it, a house filled with memories, both comforting and unsettling. He had planned to sell it, but something had pulled him back. Maybe nostalgia, maybe guilt, or maybe something else. A loud bang made Ethan jump. It came from upstairs. He muted the television, his pulse quickening. Another thud, then a creaking noise, slow and deliberate as if someone was walking across the floor. The hair on the back of his neck rose. The wind, he told himself. Just the wind rattling the old walls. But even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. The footsteps were too clear, too distinct. He stood slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The old staircase loomed in the darkness, the upstairs hidden in shadows. He hesitated. Another step. And then a whisper. So faint, so soft, he wasn't even sure he had heard it. His breath caught in his throat. He grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and, hesitating only for a moment, began to climb the stairs. Each step groaned beneath his weight, the house seeming to exhale around him. He reached the top, sweeping the flashlight beam across the hallway. The doors to the bedrooms stood open, yawning black voids in the dim light. The air was colder up here, the scent of dust and something else, something faintly rotten, lingering in the hallway. Then he saw it. The door to his grandmother's old room was ajar. It had been shut when he went to bed. His pulse pounded in his ears. He took a slow step forward, pushing the door open with his foot. The room was empty. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, but something was wrong. The rocking chair by the window was moving, a slow, steady motion back and forth, as if someone had just risen from it. Ethan swallowed hard. The window was closed. No draft. No reason for it to be moving. Then he saw the photograph. It was lying on the floor, face up. He bent down, hesitating before picking it up. It was an old black and white picture, one he didn't recognize. A little girl standing in front of the house. Her dark eyes stared directly at the camera, her expression blank. A chill ran through him. He had never seen this photograph before. Then the whisper came again. Closer. Right behind him. Ethan whirled around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. No one was there. His breathing was ragged now, fear clawing up his spine. He needed to leave. Then something moved. The closet door. It shifted ever so slightly, as if someone were inside. His grip tightened around the flashlight. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something compelled him forward. He reached out, fingers trembling, and pulled the door open. Darkness, but not empty. Hanging inside were his grandmother's old clothes, their scent of lavender and time-stained fabric still clinging to them. And beneath them, a pair of small, bare feet. Ethan staggered back, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. The feet were pale, almost translucent, barely brushing the wooden floor. And then they moved. Ethan bolted. He flew down the stairs, nearly tripping over his own feet, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The air in the house felt heavy, suffocating. As he reached the bottom, something caught his eye. A shadow, standing in the doorway to the living room, not moving, just watching. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room for a split second. And he saw her, the girl from the photograph, standing there, her dark eyes locked onto his vision blurred with panic as he lunged for the front door, yanking it open. The storm hit him like a wall, wind and rain soaking him instantly, but he didn't care. He ran. He didn't stop until he reached his car, breathless and shaking. From the driver's seat, he looked back at the house, his stomach twisting into knots. The upstairs window, the one in his grandmother's room. The curtain moved, and for the briefest moment he saw her again, watching, waiting. He left that night, never returning. A week later, he put the house up for sale. Before he left town for good, he did some research, searching through old records at the local library, and then he found it. An article, dated nearly a century ago. A little girl had once lived in the house. She had vanished one stormy night, never seen again. Some said she had fallen into the old well behind the house. Others whispered that something had taken her. Her body was never found, but her spirit remained. Ethan never spoke of what happened, never told anyone what he had seen. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain falls heavy against the windows, he hears it, a whisper, soft, cold, calling his name. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The rain pelted down on the old decrepit house, its steady rhythm a soothing soundtrack to an otherwise eerie night. The wind howled, pushing the trees into twisted shapes that cast monstrous shadows across the yard. Inside, the air was heavy with the musty scent of age, the house's wooden beams groaning under the weight of years gone by. Candles flickered weakly in the dim light, their flames occasionally dancing as if stirred by some unseen hand. Laura sat alone in the parlor, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket. She had been feeling the weight of the evening since she arrived. Her cousin, Kate, had invited her to stay for the weekend, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this old place. The house, which had been in their family for generations, was beautiful in its own right. Large windows, high ceilings, and antique furniture. But tonight, it felt like it had come alive, its dark corners watching her, waiting. She had already explored the house earlier in the day, wandering from room to room, each with its own strange, unsettling atmosphere. There was the library, full of books older than she cared to think about. The kitchen, where strange pots and pans hung from the ceiling like the remnants of a forgotten time. And then there was the attic, where the air had been so thick with dust, it seemed as though no one had dared enter it in decades. But now, as the storm raged outside, Laura found herself feeling uneasy in the parlor. The walls, lined with old portraits of stern-faced ancestors, seemed to close in around her. She had been trying to distract herself by reading, but the words blurred before her eyes, unable to pierce the fog of her anxiety. Suddenly, a loud bang came from somewhere above her. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound had come from the attic, unmistakable in its suddenness. It was a heavy, thudding noise, followed by the creaking of floorboards. Laura held her breath, straining to listen, but all was silent again. Probably just the wind, she muttered to herself, trying to convince her rattled nerves. But the wind couldn't make that kind of noise. She knew that. Her instincts were screaming at her, telling her to get up, to leave the house, to get out of there and never look back. But where could she go? The rain was torrential, the roads would be impassable soon, and Kate wasn't due back until later that evening. It was just her, alone, with the house. Laura stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting too long. She hesitated for a moment, then gathered her courage. "I'll just check it out," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the storm. With a determined breath, she made her way to the staircase, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet. The stairs creaked ominously as she ascended, her footfalls echoing in the silence of the house. The sound from above had stopped, but the air felt thick with the promise of something more, something that wasn't quite right. The attic door was at the end of the hall, just beyond the worn carpet runner that had been tread upon for years. It was a simple wooden door, almost unassuming, but Laura couldn't help the chill that crawled up her spine as she reached for the handle. She paused. The house felt too quiet now. Even the wind outside had seemed to fall silent, as though it, too, was holding its breath. With a sharp intake of air, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The attic greeted her with its stale, cold air. The dim light from the hallway barely illuminated the large open space, but it was enough for her to see the shelves and boxes piled high with forgotten trinkets and mementos. The dust was thick, and the scent of mildew hung in the air. Laura stepped inside cautiously, her shoes scraping against the worn wooden floor. She took another step forward, and that was when she saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of the room. It was quick, darting behind a stack of boxes, but it was there. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello?" she called out, her voice wavering. She didn't expect an answer, but she needed to hear the sound of her own voice. The silence was too much to bear. Nothing. Swallowing her fear, Laura stepped further into the attic, her eyes scanning the dark corners. The shadow had vanished, or so she thought, but as her gaze swept over the room, she saw it again, something moving, just at the edge of her vision. A soft, rustling sound broke the silence. Laura turned quickly, her eyes darting to the source. There, behind a large, dust-covered chest, was a figure. She gasped, her heart racing as she took a step back. The figure was hunched, cloaked in tattered clothing, its face obscured by shadows. Its presence was unsettling, unnatural. It didn't belong. "Who are you?" Laura whispered, her voice barely a breath. The figure did not move. For a moment, Laura thought it might be a trick of the light, the product of her overactive imagination. But then, the figure slowly stood up, and the air seemed to grow colder, heavier. Before Laura could react, the figure raised its hand, pointing toward the far corner of the room. She turned to follow its gaze, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The wall was lined with old portraits, the faces frozen in time, their eyes eerily lifelike. But one of the portraits, it wasn't like the others. It was of a woman, her face twisted in a grimace of fear, her eyes wide with terror. Laura's breath caught in her throat. The woman in the portrait looked familiar, too familiar. No, this can't be," Laura muttered, taking a step back. The figure in the corner was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. The attic was empty once more, but the feeling of dread remained. The storm raged outside, louder now, as if nature itself was conspiring against her. Laura's legs felt like lead, her entire body frozen with fear. She wanted to run, to escape the house, but something kept her rooted to the spot. That face in the portrait, she had seen it before. It was her own. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. She had seen that face in the portrait when she was a child, on a visit to the house many years ago. The woman in the picture was her great-great-grandmother, a woman who had disappeared without a trace many years ago. But Laura had always thought the stories about her disappearance were just family lore, a tale passed down to add mystery to the old house. Now, looking at that face, she wasn't so sure. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. She had never thought much of the stories, but now, standing in the attic, she felt as though she were a part of them. Had her great-great-grandmother, had she been trapped here, just as she was? Was this house cursed? A loud bang from downstairs interrupted her thoughts, and she spun around, her heart leaping in her chest. It came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps, as if something or someone was coming up the stairs. Laura's breath hitched. She had to leave. She had to get out of there, away from the house, away from whatever was haunting it. But before she could take a step, the attic door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash. "No!" she screamed, throwing herself at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Her heart pounded in her chest as the footsteps grew closer, each step louder than the last. She backed away from the door, her body shaking, her mind reeling. There was no way out. The house had trapped her, the walls were closing in, and she could hear the slow, deliberate footsteps now as if they were circling her, closing in on her. And then, from the corner of the room, she heard it, a voice, low, guttural, and rasping. "Leave. Now." Laura's blood ran cold. The voice was not human. It was something older, something that had been buried here for years. It was a warning. With a scream, Laura turned and bolted toward the attic window. She yanked at the sash, but it wouldn't open. The storm outside raged with all its fury, the rain slashing against the glass like 1,000 tiny knives. "Leave." The voice was closer now, right behind her. She could feel the breath on her neck, could feel the presence closing in. And then, with a sudden force, the window burst open and the cold wind tore through the attic. Laura stumbled back, but before she could make a move, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was the woman from the portrait, but not as she had seen her before. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her fingers reached out toward Laura, and in that moment the house seemed to come alive, the walls groaning and shifting, the floorboards trembling. "Leave," the woman's voice cried out, echoing through the room. Laura didn't hesitate. She ran. The wind was fierce, the rain blinding, but she didn't care. She ran as fast as she could, her feet slipping on the wet ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop until she reached the road, the house vanishing into the distance behind her. That night the storm raged until morning, but Laura never went back. She never spoke of what happened in the attic, but she knew one thing for sure. The house was not just old, it was alive, and it had claimed another soul. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It had been raining since early afternoon, a slow, steady downpour that turned the world outside into a haze of gray. The sound of raindrops tapping against the windows filled my small house, a constant, rhythmic noise that should have been soothing. Instead, it felt ominous, like a warning I couldn't quite understand. I had moved into this house a year ago, looking for solitude. It was an old place, tucked away in a quiet rural town, surrounded by thick woods on one side and an empty field on the other. The nearest neighbor was almost a mile away, and that isolation had appealed to me at first, but as the months passed, strange things started happening. Small things at first. Doors that I was certain I had closed would be found open, lights flickering even after I had the wiring checked, and the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I always brushed it off as my imagination. Living alone in an unfamiliar house could do that to anyone, right? But then there were the nights. The nights were different. I would wake up to the sound of movement in the hallway outside my bedroom, soft, deliberate footsteps. I would hold my breath and listen, but the sound would always stop as soon as I fully woke up. I convinced myself it was the house settling or the wind outside, even though deep down I knew better. Tonight, though, the feeling was worse. The air inside the house felt thick, almost suffocating. The rain had grown heavier, slamming against the roof in waves, and the wind howled through the trees. I was curled up on my couch, a blanket wrapped tightly around me, trying to distract myself with a book when I heard it. A knock. It wasn't at the front door. It was from the back door, the one that led to the woods. I froze. No one ever came to my back door. There was no path leading to it, only thick trees and undergrowth. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the dark hallway leading to the kitchen where the back door was. The knock came again, 3 slow, deliberate taps. I reached for my phone, but my hands were trembling so much I almost dropped it. I turned on the flashlight and forced myself to stand. I had to see. I had to know. Step by step, I made my way through the house, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The rain outside blurred the windows, making it impossible to see clearly. When I reached the kitchen, I hesitated, staring at the door. I could just barely make out the shape of something or someone standing on the other side. Another knock, louder this time. My breath hitched. I gripped the doorknob but didn't turn it. My instincts screamed at me not to. And then I heard it. A whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but no, it was a voice. Soft, pleading. Let me in. My blood ran cold. I stepped back, heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. The voice was so close, as if the person was pressing their face against the door. Another knock. Harder. More urgent. Please, the voice whispered again. I need to come inside. My fingers hovered over the lock. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something terrible would happen if I unlocked that door. But there was something else too. Something deeper. A feeling that whatever was outside wasn't human. I took another step back. The knocks turned into pounding. Bang, bang, bang. The entire door shook. The voice was louder now, desperate, angry. Let me in. I turned and ran. I sprinted back to the living room, my heart slamming against my ribs. I grabbed my phone and dialed my neighbor, Tom, one of the only people I knew in town. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice groggy. Hello? Tom? I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady, as someone's at my back door. There was silence on the other end. Then, what? Who? I don't know, I said. They keep knocking. They keep asking me to let them in. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then his voice came back, lower this time. Serious. Don't open it. I wasn't planning on it, I said, clutching the phone. Can you come over? I'm on my way, he said. Just stay put. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I turned off all the lights in the house and crouched by the couch, waiting. The knocking had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. I peered toward the back door from my hiding spot, trying to see if the shadow was still there. The rain blurred everything, making it impossible to tell. My fingers dug into the fabric of the couch. Then, a new sound. The creak of a door. Not the back door. The front door. My stomach dropped. I had locked it. I knew I had. I had checked it twice before sitting down for the night, but now it was open. Just a crack. A shuffling sound, slow, deliberate footsteps on the wooden floor. Someone or something was inside my house. I held my breath. My entire body was frozen. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, the rush of blood drowning out everything else. The footsteps were coming closer. My mind raced. Should I run? Hide? My phone was still in my hand, but my fingers were too stiff with fear to dial. The footsteps stopped, and then a whisper right behind me. I'm inside. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The air was ice cold. My breath came in ragged gasps. I turned on my phone's flashlight and swept it around the room. Empty. But the front door was still open. I heard tires screech outside. Tom. I ran to the door and flung it open just as his truck's headlights flooded the front of my house. He jumped out, holding a flashlight of his own. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, scanning the area. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head. He stepped inside, checking every room while I stood frozen in the doorway. There was no one inside. Nothing. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. Tom locked the doors and stayed with me for a while. He didn't ask many questions, just sat with me in silence until the rain finally let up. When he left, he looked at me seriously and said, "You should think about moving." I nodded, but I already knew I wouldn't be spending another night here. The next day, I packed my things and left. I never went back to that house. I never found out who or what had been knocking at my door that night. But sometimes on rainy nights, I still hear the whisper, "Let me in." Story, the end.
Story number 6.
I had always been the kind of person who loved the rain. The rhythmic sound of it tapping against the windows, the thick smell of damp earth in the air, the feeling of warmth inside when everything outside seemed so dark and cold. So when I found myself alone in my small, remote cabin on a particularly stormy night, I was content. The wind howled around the house, and the rain lashed against the roof. But inside I was safe, nestled under a blanket with a good book and a hot mug of tea. The cabin had been a gift from my uncle, a man I hadn't known well, but who had left it to me in his will after his passing. It was tucked away on the edge of a dense forest, far from the nearest town. I had moved in about 6 months ago, leaving the noise and chaos of city life behind. At first, the solitude had been comforting, a much-needed break. But now, after months of being alone with my thoughts, I found myself beginning to notice things in the cabin that I hadn't before. Strange things. Things I could never quite explain. That night, the wind was fiercer than usual. I could hear it rattling the windows, the trees outside swaying and creaking as they fought against the storm. My book lay forgotten in my lap as I listened to the sounds around me. There was something unsettling about the storm, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake off the feeling and took a sip of my tea, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then the sound came. It was faint at first, so subtle that I almost thought I had imagined it. A soft thud like something, or someone, had knocked against the walls of the cabin. I paused, my heart skipping a beat, and listened closely. The sound came again, this time louder, more distinct. It was coming from the attic. I froze. I had never been up there, and I hadn't seen any signs of animals or anything that could have made a noise like that. I had assumed the attic was just a dusty, unused space, and I hadn't felt the need to investigate. But now, the sound persisted, a slow, methodical tapping, as if something was moving up there, or trying to get my attention. My mind raced with possibilities. It was probably just the house settling, I reasoned, or perhaps a squirrel had gotten trapped in the rafters. But the longer I listened, the more unnerving the sound became. I stood up, feeling the weight of the storm outside and the growing sense of unease inside. My footsteps were muffled on the wooden floor as I moved toward the stairs that led up to the attic. Each creak of the old floorboards under my feet seemed to echo through the quiet house. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the noise stopped suddenly, plunging the cabin back into an eerie silence. I hesitated, my hand resting on the railing of the staircase, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I waited for a moment, but nothing happened. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, some sign that it was nothing, just the wind, the house settling. But nothing came. The silence felt too thick, too heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind now howling around the edges of the cabin, rattling the walls. I took a deep breath and began to climb the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest with each step. When I reached the top, I stood at the door to the attic, the old wooden frame slightly ajar. There was a faint smell of dust and old wood, and the temperature in the attic seemed a little colder than the rest of the house. My fingers hovered over the door handle for a moment before I pushed it open. The door creaked loudly, and the beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness of the attic. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The tapping had stopped completely, and there was only the faint sound of the wind outside. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, wooden chairs, a dusty old trunk, and piles of cardboard boxes. But there, in the far corner of the room, stood something that wasn't there the last time I had checked. A chair. An old rocking chair, its wood worn and creaky, positioned at the center of the room, facing the far wall. The strange part wasn't the chair itself, it was the way it was positioned. It was as if it had been moved. I had never seen it there before, and I couldn't remember ever hearing it creak or move on its own. I stepped further into the room, feeling an unease settle in my stomach. The air in the attic was colder, and the sense of something, someone, watching me crept over me. I shone my flashlight around the room, my eyes darting to every corner, searching for any explanation. But there was nothing, just the rocking chair, which, despite being perfectly still, seemed to radiate an eerie presence. I took another step forward, and the temperature seemed to drop even further, my breath now visible in the air. As I moved closer to the rocking chair, I noticed something else, something I hadn't seen before. A handprint. It was faint, but unmistakable. A handprint, pressed into the dust on the wooden floor next to the chair as though someone had placed their hand there recently. I bent down to get a closer look, my fingers brushing against the cool wood, and then a cold gust of wind rushed through the attic, causing the chair to creak. It was subtle, just a slight movement, but enough to make me jump. My heart began to race, and I felt a knot of fear twist in my stomach. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whisper. It was barely audible over the wind and the sound of the rain, but it was there. A soft, guttural whisper coming from the far corner of the attic, right behind the rocking chair. It sounded like someone was calling my name. Help! I froze, my blood running cold. I spun around, my flashlight beam flickering in the darkness. The chair was still, but the whisper came again, louder this time. Help me. I bolted for the stairs, my heart racing in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. I stumbled down the staircase, barely able to keep my footing as I scrambled to the bottom. When I reached the living room, I slammed the door shut behind me, my hand shaking as I tried to steady my breathing. I glanced around the room, the familiar warmth of the cabin now feeling oppressive. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the otherwise still house. The storm outside had reached a crescendo, but inside, all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I had been scared by the wind, by the creaks of the house. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something was in that attic. Something had been watching me. As I sat there in the dark, trying to calm myself, the whispering returned. It was faint at first, barely a sound over the storm, but it grew louder, closer. A voice, low and raspy, calling out to me from somewhere just beyond the reach of my hearing. Help me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat and ran out into the storm. The rain poured down in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that house, away from the darkness and the whispers. I didn't look back as I ran through the mud, my feet slipping and sliding in the torrential downpour. The storm was blinding, but I ran, ignoring the cold and the wet, desperate to escape whatever presence had followed me from the attic. I never went back to that cabin. I moved to the city shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me in that attic, something I couldn't explain. The whispers still echo in my mind sometimes, especially when it rains. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear it. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The rain had started earlier that evening, a soft drizzle that had quickly transformed into a downpour. The sound of it against the roof was almost hypnotic, a steady drumbeat that filled the silence of the old cabin. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, bending their branches into twisted, unnatural shapes. The sky was a deep, endless black, clouds swallowing any hint of moonlight. Jenna pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, shivering slightly as she stared into the flickering glow of the fireplace. The storm had knocked out the power over an hour ago, leaving her alone in the dim, flickering light. She had come to this secluded cabin for a weekend away, a much-needed escape from the noise of the city. The place belonged to her late grandfather, a quiet man who had spent his final years here, claiming he enjoyed the solitude. Jenna had always found the cabin unsettling. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, a nagging unease that crept up her spine whenever she visited as a child. Something about the way the house seemed too quiet, how shadows clung to the corners a little too long, how the creaking floorboards sometimes sounded like footsteps. She had dismissed it as childhood fear, but tonight, with the storm raging outside and the isolation pressing in, that old unease had returned. The wind howled again, rattling the windows, and she tensed. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that she was just on edge because of the storm. But then she heard it, a sound from the hallway. Soft, deliberate, a footstep. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. She strained to listen, but the only sound was the rain drumming against the roof. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Maybe it was just the old house settling, she told herself. Then another step. This time it was closer. Jenna sat frozen, gripping the edges of the blanket. The hallway led to the bedrooms, all of them empty. There was no one else in the cabin, no one but her. The fire crackled in the silence, casting shifting shadows across the wooden walls. She slowly turned her head toward the hallway, but it was swallowed in darkness. She should check, she thought. Prove to herself that nothing was there. But every instinct in her body screamed at her to stay put. Another step. Jenna's stomach twisted into knots. It wasn't just the house creaking. It was slow, deliberate. Someone was there. The door to the hallway stood slightly ajar. Just beyond it was nothing but pitch-black emptiness. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel it, something standing just out of sight. Her mouth was dry as she forced herself to move, standing up slowly. The wooden floor beneath her creaked. The noise from the hallway stopped. Jenna swallowed hard. She reached for her phone, fumbling in the dim light, her hands shaking. No signal. Of course, she was miles away from any town, in the middle of the woods, completely alone. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind shrieking against the walls. She forced herself to take a step toward the hallway. Then the whisper came. A soft, barely audible breath against her ear. "Jenna!" She screamed. Whirling around, she backed up against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. There was no one there, but she had heard it. Her name, whispered in a voice she didn't recognize. Tears burned in her eyes as she stumbled away from the hallway. The air in the cabin felt heavier, charged with something unseen, something unnatural. The shadows seemed to pulse and stretch, the firelight flickering wildly as if something had disturbed the air around it. Then the footsteps started again. But this time, they were running. Fast, coming straight for her. Jenna bolted. She ran for the front door, nearly tripping over the rug in her desperation. Her hands fumbled at the lock, her breathing ragged. Just as she yanked the door open, a gust of freezing wind slammed into her, knocking the breath from her lungs. The night outside was a blur of rain and darkness, the trees swaying violently in the storm. She stumbled onto the porch, gasping for air. The wind roared around her, but even over the noise of the storm, she heard it. The door behind her creaked, slowly. Opening wider, Jenna turned, her entire body trembling. The cabin's interior was dark, the firelight barely reaching past the doorway. She squinted, trying to see past the shadows, and then she saw it. A figure, standing just inside the cabin. Its form was barely distinguishable, a shape darker than the darkness around it, but the eyes were there, staring at her. Hollow, empty, watching. Jenna's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the wet porch. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the night, swallowed quickly by the storm. Jenna didn't wait. She ran. Barefoot, rain soaking through her clothes, she sprinted down the muddy path leading away from the cabin. She didn't know where she was going, just away. Branches scraped her arms, the wind howling around her, but she didn't stop. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. When Jenna finally reached the nearest road, she collapsed onto the wet gravel, gasping for breath. She had no idea how far she had run, only that she had made it out. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness. A car. She stumbled toward it, waving frantically. The vehicle skidded to a stop, and an older man rolled down the window, his expression one of concern. "Miss, are you all right?" Jenna could barely get the words out. The cabin, someone, something. The man's face changed. His worry deepened. "You were in that cabin?" he asked. Jenna nodded, shaking uncontrollably. The man exhaled slowly, his expression grim. "No one's supposed to go up there," he said. Jenna's stomach dropped. "What? Why?" The man hesitated. Then in a quiet voice he said, "That cabin's been empty for years, ever since the last owner, your grandfather, died." Jenna's blood ran cold. "I know, it was his cabin." The man shook his head. "No, miss, you don't understand. After he passed, people said they still heard things up there, strange noises, voices, footsteps, but no one's lived in that place for years." Jenna's breath hitched. "I was there," she whispered. "I was there tonight." The man's face darkened. "Then you were never alone." Jenna never returned to the cabin, and whatever had been inside that house, it had never truly left. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The rain tapped against the window pane like impatient fingers drumming on glass. The wind howled through the trees outside, sending eerie whispers through the empty house. Jacob sat alone in his small living room, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. It was the kind of night that made the imagination run wild, and he knew he shouldn't have been watching horror movies. He lived alone, having recently moved into this old house on the outskirts of town. The rent had been surprisingly cheap for such a large home, and though the realtor had muttered something about the house's history, Jacob had brushed it off. He wasn't superstitious, nor did he believe in ghosts. That was until the night everything changed. Jacob had barely finished his dinner when the first strange noise echoed from upstairs. It was a soft creak, the kind a wooden floor makes under the weight of a careful step. He froze, fork halfway to his mouth, listening. The house was old, maybe it was just settling. He shook off the feeling, convincing himself there was nothing to worry about. But then it happened again. A slow, deliberate step. And another. Jacob's heart began to pound. He lived alone. There shouldn't be anyone upstairs. He reached for his phone, debating whether to call someone, but then silence returned. Maybe it had been his imagination. Maybe it was just the wind. He took a deep breath and stood up, his bare feet padding softly against the wooden floor. He grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and, hesitating only for a moment, made his way up the staircase. The steps groaned under his weight, and with every step he took, he could feel his pulse in his throat. The hallway was dark. The only light came from a single bulb at the end of the corridor, flickering faintly. He moved slowly, peering into each room. His bedroom, empty. The guest room, nothing. The bathroom, silent. But when he reached the last room, the door was open. He was certain he had left it closed. Inside, the air felt different, heavy, as though something unseen had been lingering there just moments ago. He shone the flashlight around. The furniture was covered in dust, untouched since the day he had moved in. Yet the wooden rocking chair by the window was swaying slightly back and forth, as if someone had just risen from it. A cold shiver crawled up Jacob's spine. He took a step back, his breath hitching in his throat. That's when he saw it. Faint, but unmistakable. A handprint on the dusty surface of the dresser. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the living room, wide-eyed, clutching a knife from the kitchen. The house groaned and whispered around him, the wind outside howling like a wounded animal. Every so often he would hear it again, a soft creak from upstairs. The next morning, exhausted and shaken, Jacob convinced himself he had imagined it all. He needed sleep. He needed to stop scaring himself. But as he was brushing his teeth, he noticed something in the bathroom mirror. A message, written in the condensation on the glass. "Get out!" His blood ran cold. He spun around expecting to find someone behind him, but he was alone. The air in the bathroom was still damp from his shower, yet he hadn't touched the mirror. Heart pounding, he backed out of the room and grabbed his phone. He needed answers. He searched online for anything about his house, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening. And then he found it. A newspaper article dated nearly 20 years ago. A man had once lived in this house, a recluse, rarely seen, keeping to himself, until one night his neighbors heard screams. When the police arrived, they found the man dead in the upstairs room, his body twisted and contorted in a way that no human should be. The coroner had been unable to determine the cause of death. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of another person. Just the man, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. Jacob felt sick. He looked up at the staircase leading to the second floor, and for the first time, he noticed something he had ignored before, the faint, lingering scent of decay. He should have left then, should have packed his bags and never looked back. But something kept him there, an invisible weight pressing down on him, rooting him in place. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. That night, as the rain continued to fall, Jacob forced himself to go back upstairs. He had to face whatever was happening. He had to prove to himself that there was a logical explanation. He stood in the doorway of the room where the man had died, flashlight in hand. The air was thick, suffocating. And then he heard it, right behind him, a whisper. His breath hitched, his skin prickling with goosebumps. He turned slowly, flashlight shaking in his grip. The hallway was empty, but the whisper came again, closer. This time, he understood the words. Get out! Jacob didn't hesitate. He ran down the stairs, his heart hammering in his chest. He grabbed his keys and bolted out the front door into the rain, never looking back. The next morning, he called the realtor. He didn't care about breaking his lease. He didn't care about losing his deposit. He just needed to leave. The realtor's voice was calm, almost rehearsed, as if she had heard it all before. I understand, she said. You're not the first. Jacob never set foot in that house again. But sometimes, late at night, when he closes his eyes, he can still hear the whisper, soft, cold, right behind him. Get out.
Story number 9.
The rain came down in heavy sheets, hammering against the roof and windows with a relentless rhythm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the old house's wooden frame. Daniel sat alone in his small living room, nursing a cup of coffee, trying to ignore the creeping unease that had been building all night. He had rented this house 2 months ago, a small place on the outskirts of a quiet town. The price had been surprisingly low, and though the place needed work, he hadn't minded. He wanted solitude, a fresh start away from the city. But ever since he moved in, something had felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things at first. A misplaced item, doors he was sure he had closed standing open, whispers in the dead of night that he chalked up to the wind. He told himself it was just the house settling. Old places made noises. But the past few nights, it had gotten worse. The whispering had become clearer, almost like voices. And last night he had woken up to the distinct sound of footsteps in the hallway outside his bedroom door. He had bolted upright, heart racing, waiting for the sound to come again. Nothing. But when he worked up the nerve to check, the hallway light had been on. He never slept with it on. Daniel told himself he was being paranoid. He had been stressed, not sleeping well. That was all. Tonight, though, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Even now, as he sat in his chair, he could feel it. A presence, heavy, pressing. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus on the sound of the rain. Then something moved. It was faint, just at the edge of his vision. A shadow in the hallway leading to the kitchen. He turned sharply, staring into the darkness. His pulse hammered. He swallowed hard. He reached for his phone, fumbling slightly. He turned on the flashlight and aimed it down the hall. Nothing. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This was ridiculous. He was scaring himself. Then, just as he was about to turn off the light, he noticed something. The door to the basement. It was open. He was sure, absolutely sure. He had closed it. His breath caught in his throat. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He stood slowly, setting his coffee down with shaking hands. He walked toward the door, shining his light down the basement stairs. The air that rose from below was damp, thick with the scent of old wood and mildew. The basement had always unsettled him. He rarely went down there. It was unfinished, filled with old furniture left by the previous owner. He hesitated at the top of the stairs. A creak. Daniel froze. It had come from below. He strained to listen, barely breathing. Silence. His fingers tightened around the phone. He should close the door, walk away. Then, just as he took a step back, a whisper. It came from the darkness below. A single, drawn-out word. Daniel. His name. A cold wave of fear crashed over him. His blood ran ice cold. He slammed the basement door shut, locking it with shaking fingers. He stumbled back into the living room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The house seemed to close in around him, the air thick, oppressive. The rain outside had turned into a downpour, hammering against the windows, drowning out everything. But then, another sound. Not from the basement, from upstairs. A slow, deliberate creak of floorboards. Daniel's stomach lurched. He wasn't alone. His mind raced. He had checked every room before sitting down. No one was here. No one but him. Another step, then another. He grabbed the poker from the fireplace, gripping it tightly as he turned toward the staircase. He couldn't just sit there. He took slow, cautious steps toward the stairs, his pulse roaring in his ears. He lifted the flashlight, shining it up the narrow staircase. Nothing. But then, just as he stepped onto the first stair, a whisper. Close. Too close. Daniel. His breath left him in a sharp gasp. He staggered back, the flashlight shaking in his grip, and then footsteps, rushing toward him. He saw nothing. No shadow, no figure, just the sound, barreling down the stairs at him. He turned and ran, heart slamming against his ribs. He threw himself against the front door, fumbling with the lock, yanking it open. The storm hit him like a wall, the wind and rain slashing against his skin. He didn't care. He ran. Ran until he reached his truck parked in the driveway. He wrenched the door open, jumping inside, locking it behind him. The house loomed in the darkness, its windows like hollow eyes staring at him. And then the upstairs light flicked on. Daniel's breath caught. He stared frozen. A figure stood in the window, dark, motionless, watching. He felt his body go numb with terror. And then it moved. Not walking, not turning. It dropped, as if yanked violently downward by unseen hands. Daniel fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit them into the ignition. The truck roared to life, tires skidding against the wet gravel as he tore down the road. He didn't stop, didn't look back. He never went back to that house. A week later, he called the realtor, breaking his lease. He didn't care about the penalties. He didn't care about the money. He just needed to be away from that place. The realtor was eerily calm, as if she had expected his call. "You saw it, didn't you?" she said softly. Daniel felt his stomach twist. "You're not the first," she added. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't want to know. He left town that night, never telling anyone the full story. But sometimes in the quiet of the night when the rain falls hard against his window, he hears it, a whisper. Soft. Close. Daniel.
Story number 10.
The rain began just as Nathan pulled into the long, gravel driveway of the old house. It started as a light drizzle, tapping against the windshield in soft, sporadic bursts, but by the time he stepped out of his car and shut the door, the sky had opened up, unleashing a relentless downpour. He cursed under his breath, pulling the hood of his jacket over his head as he hurried toward the front door. The house belonged to his Aunt Margaret, though she hadn't lived there in years. After her husband passed away, she moved to Florida, leaving the house behind to slowly fall into disrepair. No one had been inside for years, but when Nathan mentioned needing a quiet place to get some work done, she offered it without hesitation. "It's still sturdy," she'd told him over the phone. "A little dusty, maybe, but it'll hold." Nathan had laughed at that, but now standing in the dim glow of the porch light, he felt an unease he couldn't quite place. The house loomed over him, dark and silent, its windows staring like vacant eyes. He shook off the feeling and unlocked the door. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and something else, something faintly rotten. He wrinkled his nose as he set his bag down, making a mental note to open some windows in the morning. The house was as his aunt had described, old but intact. Sheets covered most of the furniture, ghostly white in the gloom. Nathan found the main fuse box and flipped the switch. The lights flickered once before humming to life, casting weak, yellowish glows through the house. He checked his phone. No signal, of course. That was expected. After a quick dinner of cold sandwiches and chips, Nathan settled into the small study at the back of the house. The storm outside had picked up, the wind howling through the trees, rain hammering against the roof. It was the perfect night to focus. No distractions, no noise except the storm. But then there was a noise, a soft creaking from the hallway. Nathan froze, listening. Nothing. He shook his head, exhaling a small laugh. Old house noises, he muttered to himself. He turned back to his laptop, fingers poised over the keys. Then it came again. A creak. Not the sound of the house settling, but of deliberate movement. Footsteps. Nathan sat completely still. It came again. Slow. Measured. Moving toward the study. His pulse hammered in his throat. He stood up, chair scraping against the wooden floor. He called out, "Hello?" His voice sounded too loud, swallowed by the emptiness of the house. Silence. Gathering his nerve, he stepped into the hallway. Dim light from the wall sconces barely illuminated the space. At the far end, the front door remained closed. His breath came out in short, uneven bursts. He forced a chuckle. Probably a raccoon or something. The words felt hollow, even as he said them. He checked the rooms, one by one. The living room, empty. The kitchen, untouched. He checked the old guest room, the bathroom, and finally the master bedroom. Nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched prickled against his skin. Shaking his head, he returned to the study, determined to focus. He sat, pulled his laptop toward him, and opened his notes. A shuffling sound came from above, from the attic. Nathan stiffened. No. It had to be an animal. A bird, maybe. Rats, the house was old. That made sense. He refused to let his nerves get the best of him. Then came the sound of something being dragged. Slow, heavy. Not a rat, not a bird. Nathan's breath hitched. He had no intention of going up there. Not tonight. Not ever. He would check in the morning with sunlight and rationality on his side. He tried to ignore it, but the dragging sound continued, sometimes punctuated by something that almost sounded like whispering. The rain intensified outside, the wind lashing against the house. A violent clap of thunder rattled the windows, and then, for the first time all night, the house fell silent. No dragging, no creaking, just the storm. Nathan exhaled, his body still coiled tight, but he told himself it was over. He was just on edge from being alone in an unfamiliar place. And then something tapped against the study window. His head jerked up. The window overlooked the backyard. A large tree stood a few feet away, its branches swaying in the wind. He wanted to believe it was the tree, but the way the tapping came, slow, deliberate, didn't feel like random branches hitting glass. He stood, moving closer. Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard for a split second. A figure stood just beyond the tree line. Nathan stumbled back with a sharp inhale. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated in a way that wasn't natural. He hadn't seen a face, just the shape of it, unmoving, watching. His pulse pounded. He reached for his phone, but it was useless. No signal. When he looked back, the figure was gone. His mind raced. He couldn't stay here. He grabbed his keys and bolted for the front door, throwing it open. The storm raged outside, wind and rain whipping against his face, but there was no one there. Just trees. Darkness. And yet, the feeling of being watched pressed down on him. His breaths came fast and uneven. His car was parked just a few feet away. He could leave, drive back to town, but something in the back of his mind told him it wouldn't matter. Something told him that whatever was outside wasn't bound by distance. A sharp creaking noise made him whirl around. The attic door was open. It had been closed before. Nathan felt ice crawl up his spine. Slowly, he backed away. From the darkness of the attic, something moved. A shadow shifted, stretching down the wall. Then, a voice. Low, rasping. "You're not supposed to be here." Nathan ran. He didn't look back. He sprinted through the rain, yanking open his car door and fumbling with the keys. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped them. Something moved on the porch. He didn't look. He couldn't. The engine roared to life, and he slammed the car into reverse, tires skidding on wet gravel. As he turned onto the road, his headlights swept across the house. Something stood in the attic window, watching. Nathan didn't stop driving until he reached town. He never returned to that house. But sometimes in the quiet of the night, when the rain beats against his bedroom window, he hears it, the creak of slow footsteps, the whisper, "You're not supposed to be here." Story the end.